There's nothing that I'm going to talk to you about today that you don't already know. You already know about it. You have access to information on HIV/AIDS in the library, on TV, on radio, in the newspapers. But it's a good thing that you and I can sit in an open forum, listen to each other, ask questions about a subject which is very close to all of us. But it's a subject that I want you to know about, but don't get intimately involved with. Now, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, said at the General Assembly HIV high-level meeting which I attended the following words, quote, "Today we have a chance to end this epidemic once and for all. That is our goal. Zero new HIV infections, zero discrimination, and zero AIDS-related deaths," unquote. Now, the AIDS syndrome was first reported over 30 years ago. The response has been concerted and has achieved some good results, moving us from a state of utter despair to one of hope. The response, however, is ongoing, but there is still a need for us to do much more and to again fasten our pace so that we can move from eradication, move on to eradication, which must be our final goal. Now, globally, in 2011, there were 34.2 million people living with HIV/AIDS. 34.2 million people. Now, you know our population is just over 800,000. There were 34.28 million people in the world. Now, the sub-Saharan Africa region is the most affected, with 23.5 million people, representing 69% of the global HIV burden. In 2011, it was estimated that 2.5 million people became newly infected with HIV/AIDS. 25 countries have seen a 50% or greater reduction in new HIV infections since 2001. Now, half of all the reductions in new HIV infections in the last 3 years had been among newborn children, showing that the antenatal response is working and that the elimination of new infections in children can be achieved. In 2011, new infections in children were 24% lower than in 2009. But progress around the world is uneven. That is the thing to remember. Now, since 2001, new infections in the Middle East and in North Africa increased by more than 35%. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, there had also been an increase in new infections. Now, globally, in 2011, some 1.7 million people died from AIDS-related causes, showing a decline of 24% since the peak in 2005, when HIV/AIDS was at its worst. Between 2005 and 2011, the number of AIDS-related deaths declined by nearly 1/3 in sub-Saharan Africa, by 48% in the Caribbean, which is the second most affected region in the world, and 41% in Oceania, our region. But there were significant increases in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. the Middle East, and North Africa. In 2011, more than 8 million people had access to the life-saving antiretroviral treatment, ART for short, increased by 63%. In 10 low and middle income countries, more than 80% of those eligible are receiving antiretroviral treatment. But unfortunately, 7 million people eligible for treatment still do not have access to it, including 72% of children living with HIV. In 2011, the number of children under 16 years estimated to be living with HIV was 3.3 million. The deaths of children due to AIDS in 2011 was 230,000. Now, tuberculosis or TB related deaths in people living with HIV has fallen by 25% since 2004. However, TB remains the leading cause of death amongst people living with HIV. All people living with both TB and HIV should start antiretroviral therapy immediately, as it can reduce the risk of TB illness amongst people living with HIV by up to 65%. However, in 2011, fewer than half of the people with TB who had an HIV positive test result obtained ART. HIV infection is the most potent risk factor from converting latent TB infection into active TB disease. It has been medically confirmed that the TB bacteria accelerates the progression of HIV infections to AIDS. Now, many people living with HIV in low income and middle income countries develop TB as the first manifestation of AIDS. The two diseases form a deadly combination. Young people aged 14 to 29 years of age, including everyone sitting in this room, account for 40% of all new adult HIV infections. Globally, infection rates in young women 14 to 29 years are twice as high as young men of the same age. Now, global investments. Global investments for HIV leveled off for the first time in 2009 to US dollars 15.9 billion, which was US dollars 10 billion short of what was required in 2010 for response. In 2011, the amount was US dollars 16.8 billion, which was again short of what was needed in 2012. The expenditure on AIDS remains insufficient. Now, international funding comes from major donor countries and multilateral institutions, like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. The estimated annual need by 2015 is between US dollars 22 to 24 billion. Why 2015, you may ask? 2015 is the deadline for the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs for short, and you already know about the MDGs. Now, for us, the achievement of the MDGs has been our aim for some time, as it has been with other countries around the world. Now, whether we can achieve MDG 6, which is to combat HIV AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, is now the big question. That's why I'm here to talk to you today. Now, closer to home, we have the Pacific Fund, which is funded by Australia and New Zealand. 2 years ago, the funding was 37 million. Now, both these funds, the Pacific Fund and the Global Fund, have been of great assistance to our area. Now, international investments for AIDS have for some times remained stable, but there are signs that these investments are declining and will further do so due to the continuing global economic crisis.